The air in the council chamber smelled like old metal and something burning. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in that morning. Not the towering crystalline walls, not the thousands of delegates already seated in concentric rings above me, not the pale blue light that poured down from the ceiling like filtered starlight, just that smell. Sharp and faint at the same time, like a warning that had been left out too long. My name is Dara Vasquez. I have been Earth's senior diplomatic observer to the Galactic Council for 22 years, and in 22 years, I have learned that when something smells wrong in that chamber, it is because something wrong is about to happen. I took my seat in the observer gallery. The observer gallery is not at the main table. It is not even close to the main table. It is a raised platform at the far end of the chamber, behind a thin barrier of frosted glass, positioned so that the delegates at the main table cannot easily see your face. I used to think that was accidental. I stopped thinking that about 18 years ago. My assistant, a young man named Peter Cole, slid into the seat beside me and handed me a small screen. He was 26, sharp-eyed, and had the particular talent of being able to read a room before anyone else in it. He had been with me for 3 years. I trusted him more than almost anyone alive. "The vote is in 40 minutes, he said quietly. They moved it up. "I know," I said. "The hegemony block has the numbers. I know that too." He looked at me. He was trying to read my face, which most people find difficult. I have spent 2 decades making it difficult on purpose. "You're not worried," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm extremely worried," I said. "I'm just not surprised." The Galactic Council had been in session for over 400 years. It was, by every measure the galaxy's dominant civilizations used to measure such things, the greatest governing body in known space. It had ended 3 interstellar conflicts. It had established the resource-sharing frameworks that powered a dozen economies. It had, over the course of its long history, admitted 61 member species as full voting members, and another 43 as observer species. Earth was one of the 43. We had been observers for 40 years. 40 years of sitting behind the frosted glass. 40 years of watching votes happen that affected our solar system, our trade routes, our access to galactic communications networks, without ever being allowed to cast a single vote in return. 40 years of submitting formal proposals that were received politely, filed efficiently, and never discussed again. 40 years of being told, in language that was always careful and always kind, that humanity was a promising species still in the early stages of civilizational development, and that full membership would be considered once we had demonstrated the necessary maturity. The necessary maturity. I had heard that phrase so many times that it had lost its sting somewhere around year 12. By year 20, it had become almost funny, in the way that something deeply unfair becomes funny when you have looked at it long enough. Humanity had given the Council 17 pharmaceutical breakthroughs in 40 years. We had contributed terraforming algorithms that were now standard across 4 star systems. Our material scientists had solved a bonding problem that the O'Reilly Compact had been working on for 2 centuries, and we had shared the solution freely, because that was what you did when you wanted to demonstrate that you were a cooperative and mature civilization. We shared everything. We asked for nothing. We waited. And now the Council was going to vote on reclassifying Earth's solar system as a transitional resource zone. I had read the proposal 3 times. It was written in the beautifully careful language that the Veth Hegemony's legal staff always used, full of phrases like provisional stewardship and collaborative extraction framework. But what it meant, stripped of all the careful language, was simple. The asteroid belt, Luna, and Mars would be open to mining operations run by hegemony corporations. Earth's consent was not required. Earth was not a full member. Earth did not have a vote. Earth did not, under the current charter, have any legal standing to object. The proposal had been filed 6 weeks ago. I had spent every day of those 6 weeks filing formal concerns, requesting procedural reviews, and writing careful, detailed objections that were received politely, filed efficiently, and never discussed again. Peter leaned forward slightly. In the chamber below, the delegates were settling into their seats. The Veth Hegemony's lead counselor, a tall being named Vorsavith, was speaking quietly to 2 of his colleagues near the center table. He was smiling. I had seen that smile before. It was the smile of someone who had already counted the votes. "The Cheth Collective's ambassador is watching you," Peter said. I did not look toward the Cheth gallery. I already knew. Ambassador Kellethrix and I had spoken 4 days ago, in a quiet meeting that had not been logged in any official calendar. Kellethrix was small, quick-eyed, and one of the most precise minds I had ever encountered. The Cheth Collective had been observer species for 60 years. They understood what it meant to sit behind the frosted glass longer than I ever would. "Let her watch," I said. The session was called to order. The council speaker, a being called Veldasari, who had chaired this chamber for over 3 centuries, began the formal proceedings in the measured, unhurried voice that ancient species seem to develop when they have conducted enough meetings to stop finding them interesting. The proposal was read aloud, the terms were laid out, the question was put to the table. One of the smaller hegemony-aligned delegations seconded the motion immediately, before the echo of the speaker's words had fully died. It was a choreographed move. They had rehearsed this. I watched the voting indicators on the small screen in front of my seat begin to move, the main table's positions updated in real time. Yes, yes, abstention. Yes, yes, yes. The numbers climbed with a kind of mechanical certainty. There was a single no vote. It was Earth's formal objection, submitted through the observer channel. The speaker noted it without expression, then noted that it was procedurally non-binding, as observer submissions always were. 14 votes in favor, 1 non-binding objection from the gallery. The motion passed. Vorsavith gathered his papers with the calm efficiency of a man who has never, in his long political life, been surprised by anything. One of his colleagues said something to him and he smiled again. That same smile. I sat very still. Peter said nothing. He had learned, over 3 years, when to say nothing. On my personal device, a message arrived. It had been routed through 6 different communication relays and had no traceable origin point. When I opened it, there was only an image of a chess piece, a queen, and 5 words. "Your move, Ambassador. It begins." I looked at the image for a long time. Then I looked at the chamber below, at the delegates who were already moving on to the next item on the agenda, at Vorsavith who had already forgotten us, at the glass that separated our gallery from the main table, at the light coming down from the ceiling like something that had never been warm. I put the device away. I had been waiting 22 years for this moment, not for the vote. I had known the vote was coming. I had known it was coming for 4 years. I had planned around it, worked around it, built something carefully and quietly around it that Vorsavith and his colleagues had no idea existed. I had been waiting for the moment that would make what came next not just necessary, but undeniable. A moment the galaxy could point to and say, this is why it had to happen. This is where they left us no choice. They had just given me that moment, in front of 4,000 witnesses, in a chamber that recorded every vote for the permanent historical archive. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I looked at Peter, who was watching me with an expression caught somewhere between calm and something that might have been excitement. "Clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks," I said. "Already done," he said. Outside the chamber, in the long corridor of pale stone that connected the observer gallery to the diplomatic transit hub, I walked at exactly my normal pace. Not faster, not slower. I passed other observer species delegates going the other way, some of whom nodded at me, some of whom looked away, all of whom had just watched the same vote I had. At the end of the corridor, in a small waiting room that smelled like recycled air and old upholstery, Director Nora Osei was standing with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at a blank wall as if it had said something interesting. She was 61 years old and had spent the last 30 of them running an office whose existence was classified at a level so high that most of the people it reported to did not know what they were authorizing when they signed the budget. She looked at me when I walked in. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, well, I said. "It's time," she said. "Yes," I said. She unclasped her hands and straightened slightly, the way a person does when they have been waiting for something for a very long time, and it has finally arrived. "Then let's not waste another minute of it. The story of what happened next, what humanity had been quietly building while the galaxy looked the other way, is not the story of a single moment. It is the story of 30 years of patience, 10,000 small decisions made in rooms no one was watching, and a plan so carefully designed that even I, the person who was about to execute it, had not seen all of it until now. But every story has to start somewhere. Ours started the moment Vorsavith smiled and put down his papers. And that moment had just passed. The first thing Nora told me was that I had been kept partially in the dark on purpose. I was not surprised by this. I had suspected it for years, but hearing it said plainly, sitting across from her in the small transit room, while the council chamber hummed behind its walls, still produced something in my chest that was not quite anger, and not quite relief. It was more like the feeling of a key turning in a lock you had forgotten you were carrying. Your reactions in the chamber had to be genuine, she said. If they were staged, someone would have noticed. You've been watched for years. I know I've been watched, I said. Then you understand. I did understand. It made sense. It was the kind of thinking that Nora's office had always been built on, the patient, unsentimental recognition that the most valuable tool in any long negotiation is not information, but authentic surprise. If I had known the full scope of what Earth had been doing, my face in that chamber over 2 decades would have been different in ways I might not have been able to control. Even the best diplomatic composure has limits. What Nora told me in the next 4 hours changed the shape of everything I thought I knew about the last 30 years. The Quiet Office had been created in the 22nd year of Earth's observer membership, not by an order from the Diplomatic Corps or the Earth Council or any formal government body, but by a group of 12 people who had looked at the pattern of humanity's treatment by the Galactic Council and reached a conclusion that was simple and devastating. It was not going to get better by asking. It was going to get better by becoming impossible to ignore, and that was going to require a different kind of work than diplomacy. The office had no official name for the first decade. Nora called it the Quiet Office because that was what it was: quiet, careful, and operating at a level of patience that most institutions cannot sustain. It had been funded through a layered series of legitimate research grants, commercial contracts, and diplomatic operational budgets, spread thin enough that no single auditor looking at any single line would ever see the whole picture. What it had built, over 30 years, was remarkable. The first thing was the network, Earth's official communications infrastructure within galactic space, ran through Council-maintained relay systems, which meant that everything Earth sent or received could, in theory, be monitored, delayed, or interrupted by parties with access to those systems. The Quiet Office had spent 15 years building a parallel network, a distributed web of communication nodes hidden inside commercial shipping infrastructure, research stations, and the personal devices of a carefully selected group of humans stationed throughout Council-controlled space. It was not faster than the official network. It was, however, completely invisible to Council monitoring systems because it did not use any technology that the Council recognized as a communication system. It used a method derived from quantum biology research that human scientists had developed and quietly chosen not to publish. The second thing was the fleet. I had to stop Nora when she said this. How many ships? I said. 64, she said. 64. Earth's official registered fleet in galactic space consisted of 11 commercial transport vessels and 3 diplomatic couriers. The idea that we had also quietly assembled 64 additional ships without the Council's knowledge required a moment of processing. Nora explained it without ceremony. The ships had been built in stages, in 3 different shipyards, with components sourced through 40 different commercial supply chains. They had been registered under 6 different corporate entities as freight carriers and scientific research vessels. They were, by every measure the Council's monitoring systems used to classify vessels, exactly what their registrations said they were. They were also, under the civilian exteriors that showed up on Council sensors, something else entirely. The engineering teams that had modified them were good. Nora said they were the best. I believed her. Where are they now? I asked. Most of them are in holding positions at the edge of the Sol system, she said. 2 are already positioned near the hegemony's primary staging area. They've been there for 11 days. The third thing was the coalition. This was the part that made me understand why Nora had been running this operation for 30 years and not 5. It was not the ships. It was not the network. It was the relationships. For 30 years, The quiet office had been cultivating quiet, careful, deeply patient relationships with the other observer species in the Galactic Council. Not through official diplomatic channels. Those conversations were logged, monitored, and reported through other means. Through scientists who shared research at conferences, through traders who met in transit stations, through cultural exchanges that looked, from the outside, like exactly what they were described as, and were also something more. There were 43 observer species in the Council. The quiet office had made genuine contact with 31 of them. Of those 31, 19 had, over the course of years and many careful conversations, arrived at the same conclusion that Earth had arrived at 40 years ago, and had agreed to act on it together. 19 species. Some of them had been observer members for longer than humanity had been a spacefaring civilization. Some of them had made contributions to the Council's shared knowledge base that dwarfed anything Earth had offered. All of them had been told, in careful and kind language, that they were promising civilizations still in the early stages of development. All of them had sat behind their frosted glass and waited. They were not waiting anymore. When Kellathrix looked at me during the vote, I said. She knew the vote was the trigger, Nora said. We agreed on that signal 2 years ago. The resource zone reclassification was always the most likely escalation point we prepared for it. And the others? All 19 coalition ambassadors have already submitted their formal motions of objection to the Council's procedural office. They were filed in the 10-minute window after the vote closed, before any hegemony staff had time to check the procedural calendar. They are all valid. We spent 6 years making sure they would be valid. I looked at her. She was watching me with the calm, slightly tired expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. You spent 6 years making sure 19 different species' diplomatic submissions would be procedurally unassailable? I said. 8 years, she said. The first 2 were for identifying which submission pathways were the weakest and fixing them without drawing attention. I thought about Vorsavith and his smile. I thought about the careful language in the resource zone proposal, written by the best legal staff the hegemony's money could retain. I thought about the 10,000 small decisions Nora's office had made in rooms no one was watching. They have no idea, I said. None, she said. Somewhere beyond the walls of the transit room, a communications channel opened. Nora's assistant, a quiet woman named Helen Price who had been with the office for 12 years, leaned in through the doorway and said, very calmly, that the hegemony's first mining barges had just entered the Sol system. Nora and I looked at each other. And, Nora said. Helen Price permitted herself a very small smile. They're running quiet. All their communication systems went dark about 3 minutes after they crossed the boundary. They can't reach their home base. They can't reach each other. They're sitting there like very expensive and very confused furniture. The communication blackout. The third layer of preparation. Humanity's scientists had spent 11 years developing a form of localized quantum interference that, when activated within a specific region of space, caused every standard galactic communication technology to stop functioning. It left no detectable trace. It caused no physical harm. It simply made a region of space go very, very quiet. The Council's technical observers would log it as an anomalous stellar phenomenon. Earth scientists had even published a paper about it 2 years ago, in a minor academic journal, under the heading of Theoretical Space Weather Research. The paper had been read by 12 people and cited by none of them. How long can we maintain it? I asked. As long as we need to, Nora said. I stood up. There was a council session in the morning, an emergency session, called by the hegemony, because their mining barges had gone silent in Sol space, and they had, presumably, started to understand that something was not proceeding as planned. I would be in that chamber, not in the observer gallery. For the first time in 22 years, I had somewhere else to sit. They're going to push back hard, I said. Vorsavith is not going to take this quietly. No, Nora agreed. But that's all right. We didn't need him to take it quietly. We just needed him to take it in a room with 4,000 witnesses and a permanent historical archive. I thought about that. Then I thought about the 19 species sitting behind their frosted glass right now, reading the notification that their procedural submissions had been accepted, that they had been granted floor time in the morning session, that after years of silence they were finally, formally, undeniably allowed to speak. "What do you need me to do tonight?" I asked. Nora handed me a data pad. On it was a document that was 4,000 pages long. At the top, it said, "The Coalition Accords, Framework for Reformed Galactic Membership." "Read it," she said. "All of it. You're delivering it tomorrow." I took the pad. It was heavier than it looked, which seemed right. "Anything else?" "Sleep if you can," she said. "And Dara, whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you're thinking, hold on to it. You're going to need it in that chamber tomorrow. All of it." I nodded. I walked to the door. Then I stopped, because something had been sitting in the back of my mind since Nora had told me I had been kept in the dark on purpose, and I needed to ask it. "The plan," I said. "The whole plan. Did you ever think it would fail?" Nora was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means someone is giving a question the respect it deserves, instead of answering it fast. "Every day," she said. "I thought about every way it could fall apart. Every single day for 30 years. That's not weakness. That's how you build something that doesn't fall apart." I looked at her. At this woman who had spent 30 years in the quiet, building something in rooms that no one was watching, for a future she was not certain she would live to see. "Thank you," I said. She shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it's done." I left. The corridor outside was empty now. The council complex was quieter at night, though it never fully slept. Somewhere in those vast halls, beings from dozens of species were reading reports, sending messages, preparing for the next day's sessions in the ways that their particular natures required. I walked back toward the diplomatic quarters with the 4,000-page document glowing on the pad in my hand, and for the first time in 22 years I did not feel like I was walking away from the table. I felt like I was walking toward it. I arrived at the chamber at 6 in the morning. The session did not start until 9. I arrived at 6 because I wanted to see the room when it was empty. The observer gallery was unlocked, as it always was. I walked through the frosted glass barrier and stood at its edge, looking down at the main table, at the concentric rings of delegate seats rising above it, at the pale light coming down from a ceiling that was, in truth, a transparent panel showing real space. The galaxy spread out above this room in a soft smear of light, as it had been for 400 years of sessions, a reminder, by design, of what all of this was supposed to be about. I had stood in this spot hundreds of times. I had looked at that table hundreds of times. I had watched hundreds of votes happen at that table that I was not permitted to influence, recorded hundreds of decisions that shaped human lives without a single human hand in the making of them. I stood there for a long time, just looking. Then I walked back through the frosted glass, down the main corridor, past the security checkpoint that had always, until this morning, directed me to the observer entrance. This morning I showed a different credential. The clerk at the checkpoint, a young Orali delegate assistant with pale green markings on her forearms, looked at the credential, looked at me, looked at the credential again. "Ambassador Vasquez," she said, "you're listed for floor access." "Yes," I said. She processed it. She handed my credential back. She said nothing else, but I saw her glance at a colleague across the room, and I saw the colleague's expression shift in a way that meant the message would reach Vorsavith's staff within the hour. Good. I wanted it to reach them. Peter was already at the floor-level entry, which was how I knew how well he was doing his job. He had 2 assistants with him, both carrying data pads, both looking slightly as though they had not slept, which was accurate, because I had sent them the Coalition Accords document at midnight and told them to have summaries of every procedural section ready by 7. "Summary?" I said. "All 19 Coalition ambassadors are confirmed for the session," Peter said, falling into step beside me as we moved toward the floor. "Kelathrix arrived 2 hours ago. The Mirani Elder, Ambassador So-Ren, came in last night and has been in the preparation room since 5. The Dasari Federation's delegate has requested a pre-session meeting with you, which I declined on your behalf." Good. The hegemony has filed 2 procedural challenges to the coalition submissions overnight. Both were reviewed and rejected by the procedural office at 4 in the morning. I stopped walking. Who reviewed them at 4 in the morning? Peter allowed himself a brief, precise smile. The procedural office keeps a night duty officer on rotation. This month it happens to be Senior Archivist Ven Cho, who has been on record for the last 6 years as an advocate for strengthening observer species procedural rights. I thought about Nora's 8 years of patient work. Of course it is, I said. Both rejections are now entered into the permanent archive, Peter continued. The hegemony cannot refile the same challenges. They can file new ones, but any new procedural challenge to a coalition submission will require a full committee review, which takes a minimum of 14 days. 14 days was longer than we needed. We reached the chamber floor. I had been on this floor twice in 22 years, once for a formal ceremony on Earth's admission as an observer, and once to deliver a written statement on behalf of the Earth Council that was entered into the record without discussion. Both times I had stood at a small podium near the gallery entrance, clearly demarcated as a visiting observer, and returned to my seat behind the glass when I was done. Today I walked to the delegation station assigned to Earth. It was at the main table. It had a nameplate. It said Earth, in both Galactic Standard Script and English, and I was nearly certain that the English had been added overnight by someone in Nora's office who had a sense of occasion. I sat down. The room was still mostly empty, but the delegates who were already in their seats were noticing. I could feel it without looking. The small shifts in attention, the slight adjustments in posture, the quiet conversations that paused and then resumed at a lower volume. 3 hegemony staffers near the main table's northwest end looked at me, then at each other, then at their data pads, then at me again. I arranged my notes. I drank from the water glass that had been set at the station. I looked, to anyone watching, like a person who had sat at this table every day of her life. By 8:30, the chamber was filling. By 8:55 it was full. 4,000 beings from across the known galaxy, settling into their places, and somewhere in that vast room, a new configuration was making itself felt, because 19 observer species ambassadors were not in the observer gallery. They were on the floor, at delegation stations that had been quietly arranged overnight, and the gallery was, for the first time in living memory, completely empty. Vorsavith arrived at 8:58. He was mid-conversation with 2 colleagues, and carrying himself with the ease of someone who has been the most powerful person in every room he has ever entered. He reached the hegemony station. He sat down. He looked at his data pad. Then he looked up. He looked at me, sitting at the Earth station, at the main table. Then his eyes moved, slowly, because even now he was a controlled man, around the floor. 19 ambassador stations that should have been empty. 19 delegation placards that should not have been there. 19 species that had never, in the history of this chamber, been permitted to sit at this table. I watched his expression process this information. It was, I had to admit, a masterclass in controlled response. He did not react visibly. He simply absorbed it, the way a mountain absorbs wind. And then he turned back to his colleagues and said something very quietly. One of them glanced at me. One of them looked at his data pad and began typing quickly. Speaker Veldasari called the session to order at exactly 9 o'clock. The emergency agenda item, the hegemony's formal inquiry into the communications anomaly affecting their mining vessels in the Sol system, was the first listed item. The Vorsavith requested the floor. It was granted. He was, I have to say, very good. He spoke for 7 minutes about the seriousness of the situation, about the unexplained communications disruption affecting hegemony property, operating under a legally authorized extraction framework, about the Council's responsibility to ensure that member state operations were not subjected to interference of any kind, about the need for an immediate investigation. He did not raise his voice. He did not use language that could be characterized as aggressive. He was precise, measured, and entirely in control of the room. When he finished, the speaker opened the floor for responses. Before any of the regular delegates could move, 19 hands went up simultaneously. 19 ambassador signals from 19 delegation stations that had never, until today, been on the floor. The chamber went very still. Speaker Veldasari looked at the 19 signals for a moment. Then the speaker said, in the measured and unhurried voice that 3 centuries of chairing had produced, that the chair recognized the representative of the Cheth collective. Kelethric stood. She was small, and from where I sat, I could see the slight quickness in her movements that meant she was holding something tightly under a calm exterior. I understood the feeling exactly. She spoke for 4 minutes. She spoke about the council charter. She spoke about the definition of legally authorized extraction and the specific clauses that defined what consent was required and from whom. She cited 17 precedents. Every citation was accurate, because I had reviewed her notes 3 nights ago. When she sat down, before Vorsavith could respond, the speaker recognized the representative of the Mirani remnant. So Ren stood. She was very old. She had been an ambassador for 61 years, longer than I had been alive. She spoke for 3 minutes, and what she said in those 3 minutes was a history. A quiet, precise, almost gentle accounting of every formal request, every policy submission, every procedural petition that the Mirani remnant had filed with the Galactic Council over 60 years. Every one of those documents, the dates, the responses, the archive numbers where the polite rejections could be found. The chamber listened. I watched the Veth hegemony delegates watch her, and I watched the Orali Compact delegates watch her, and I watched 300 years of institutional power encounter, something it was not designed for, which was the recorded weight of its own behavior, read back to it by the people it had affected. When Soren sat down, the speaker recognized the representative of Earth. I stood, and here is what happened in the chamber when I stood, which I did not expect, and which I will never forget for the rest of my life. It went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a large room paying attention. It went very, very still, in the way that an enormous space goes still when something has shifted inside it, and everyone in it has registered the shift at the same moment, without being able to say precisely what it was. 4,000 beings. Quiet, looking at me. I had prepared a speech. I had worked on it for 36 hours. It had 17 sections, covered every major legal and procedural point in the coalition accords, and was, I thought, probably the most carefully constructed thing I had ever written. I looked at my notes, then I looked up at the room, then I set my notes down. My name is Dara Vasquez, I said. I have represented Earth in this chamber for 22 years. In those 22 years, I have never been permitted to stand at this table. I stand here today because yesterday, this council voted to take something that belongs to my species, and I am here to tell you, respectfully, and on the record, that this cannot continue. I paused, not because Earth is angry, not because Earth is threatening, but because what this council has done to 43 species who deserve better is documented, detailed, and now formally entered into your permanent archive by 19 ambassadors who have run out of patience with being patient. I reached into the portfolio in front of me and removed a data chip. I held it up. The coalition accords, I said. 4,000 pages, every legal precedent accounted for, every procedural requirement met, a complete framework for reformed galactic membership, compensation for past practices, and a path forward that works for everyone in this room. I set the chip on the table. We are not here to fight, I said. We are here to finish something that should have been finished 40 years ago. Then I sat down. The chamber was still quiet. Vorsavith was looking at the chip on the table. His face was showing nothing, which meant something was happening behind it. I watched him and waited, because I was very, very good at waiting. Speaker Veldasari looked at the chip, then at me, then at the 19 delegation stations on the floor. Then, and this was the moment I had been building toward for 22 years, the speaker opened their mouth, and closed it, and opened it again, and closed it again, 3 times. 4,000 beings watched Speaker Veldasari, who had chaired this chamber for over 3 centuries without ever being at a loss for words, search for words, and not find them. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Then a delegate from the Orali Compact, not Vorsavith, not a hegemony ally, but one of the Orali Compact's senior representatives, a woman named Admiral Tenshova who I had spoken to exactly once in 22 years, and who I had always thought had sharper eyes than her title suggested, raised her hand and requested to be recognized. The speaker, still slightly unsteady, recognized her. Tenshova stood. that she looked at me. She looked at the chip on the table. She looked at Vorsavith. Then she said, clearly and without any preliminary language, that the Orali Compact wished to be listed as co-sponsors of the Coalition Accords and requested that formal review proceedings begin immediately. The compact had just broken. Vorsavith's expression did not change, but one of the staffers beside him stood up from his seat, quickly, and left the chamber. That staffer was going to find a secure communication line. He was going to try to reach the hegemony's home government. He was not going to succeed. The communication anomaly in this sector of space was, according to Earth's most recent scientific data, expected to persist for some time. I looked down at the table, at the chip, at my hands, which were completely steady. Peter caught my eye from the support staff section along the wall. He did not smile. He simply gave me a very small nod, the kind of nod that means everything is proceeding as it should. I looked at the 19 delegation stations, at Kella Thrix, who was making a note on her pad with perfect focus, at So-Ren, who was looking at the ceiling, at the galaxy above the transparent panel, with an expression that I did not have a name for, but that I understood completely. The speaker called for a formal review session to begin the following morning. The Coalition Accords would be distributed to all delegations by end of day. A procedural committee would be formed. The process, the real process, the one that mattered, had begun. The session was adjourned. Vorsavith gathered his papers. He stood. He looked at me one more time across the length of the main table, and for a moment, something moved behind his face that was not anger, exactly, and not respect, exactly, but was perhaps the distant relative of both. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. I stayed in my seat. I let the room empty around me. I listened to the sound of 4,000 beings making their way toward the exits, the low hum of voices, the shift of movement through a space that was, for the first time in 40 years, carrying a different kind of weight. When the room was nearly empty, Peter came and stood beside me. The Orali Compact is going to push for an accelerated review timeline, he said. Their legal team has already requested the full document. That's fine, I said. We built it to survive a fast review. Vorsavith's office has sent 3 messages to the hegemony's home government. None of them have reached their destination. I know. So-Ren is asking if you have a moment after the session. She'd like to meet. Yes, I said. Tell her I'll come to her. Peter nodded. Then he said quietly, how do you feel? I thought about that. About 22 years of frosted glass. About the smell of something burning that I had noticed when I walked in this morning. About Vorsavith's smile last night, before the vote, when everything had still seemed simple. Like we just started, I said. We're not done yet. No, Peter agreed. But we're doing well. I looked at the chip on the table, at the galaxy on the ceiling, at the empty chair where the speaker had sat through 3 centuries of sessions, and never, until this morning, been silent for 11 seconds. Go tell So-Ren I'm on my way, I said. He went. I sat there for one more moment, alone in the enormous room, in the quiet that it held now. A different kind of quiet than the one I had grown up with, behind the frosted glass. This quiet had a future in it. Then I stood up and walked toward it. The formal review of the Coalition Accords began at 9 in the morning, and was still running at 11 at night. I know because I was present for all of it. The Council's procedural committee was composed of 7 delegates, 2 from the Veth hegemony, 1 from the Orali Compact, 1 from the Dasari Federation, and 3 from smaller, fully enrolled member species who had no strong alliance with either the hegemony or the Compact. The committee's job was to assess the legal validity of the Accords, identify any procedural problems, and make a recommendation to the full Council on whether to bring it to a formal vote. Vorsavith had been removed from the process, officially, because the hegemony was named in the compensation clauses, and therefore had a conflict of interest in reviewing the document. This was a technicality that we had planted specifically in the draft language, because we had known, from the moment we began writing the Accords, that Vorsavith could not be allowed anywhere near the review process. He had known it too. Within an hour of reading the Accords, I was told by one of Peter's network contacts that his reaction, in private, had been what was diplomatically described as vigorous. The 2 hegemony delegates on the committee were capable people. They worked fast and they were clearly looking for gaps. They did not find any. The Accords had been written by 47 legal experts from 8 species over a period of 6 years, and every conceivable counter-argument was addressed in the footnotes. I had read the whole document the night before delivering it, and what struck me most was not the main text but the footnotes, thousands of them, careful and precise, anticipating objections that had not yet been made, and answering them in language so thorough that making the objection afterward would have felt redundant. The review was not easy. The hegemony's 2 delegates raised 41 formal challenges over the course of the 2 days. 39 of them were resolved by reference to existing charter law. 1 was referred to a subcommittee for clarification. 1. A challenge to the compensation calculation methodology required a full session of argument that lasted 6 hours. I argued it myself. Helen Price, who had spent 3 years on the compensation methodology, was in the support section and fed me data through Peter as the session progressed. By the end of it, the hegemony delegates' challenge had been reduced to a technical objection about the interest rate applied to a 40-year retroactive calculation, and the committee chair, the independent delegate from the Shari Collective, a methodical being named Archivist Luveth who had clearly read every single page of the document, ruled that the methodology was sound. After that, the challenges became smaller. They became the kind of challenges that are filed not because anyone believes they will succeed, but because filing them creates a procedural record that can be used to slow things down. We had prepared for that too. Every response was fast, specific, and entered immediately into the permanent archive. The Orally Compact's delegate on the committee, a junior representative named Kale Sun who had been assigned because the Compact's senior staff were apparently busy with other things, which told me everything about how the Compact had decided to position itself, voted yes on every resolution. The Compact had made its choice. They were not going to be on the losing side of this. The Dasari Federation's delegate was a careful, older being named Grand Archivist Vendaro, who said very little throughout the review, but watched everything with the specific attention of someone who is building an accurate internal record. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, during a recess, she came and stood next to me in the corridor outside the review room and said, very quietly, that she had a question. Go ahead, I said. Were you ever afraid, she said, that it would fail? It was almost exactly what I had asked Nora 2 nights ago. Yes, I said, every day. That's not a weakness. That's how you build something that doesn't fall apart. She was quiet for a moment. The Dasari Federation has not been as affected by the current membership structure as the observer species, she said. But we have watched. We have kept records. I know, I said. Our records match yours, she said. Then she walked back into the review room. On the evening of the 2nd day, the procedural committee delivered its recommendation to the full council. The coalition accords were legally sound, procedurally complete, and recommended for a full vote. The vote was scheduled for the following morning. I went back to the diplomatic quarters that night and sat at the small desk in my room and did not sleep. I was not anxious. Exactly. It was more that the events of the last 3 days had a momentum to them that made stillness feel strange, like trying to stand still in moving water. Peter knocked at 11. I told him to come in. He sat down in the chair across from the desk. He had the particular quality of tired that only comes from sustained, focused work. Not the collapsing kind, but the clear-eyed kind. The kind that means everything has been done that can be done. How is Soren? I asked. I had met with her the previous afternoon, briefly. She's resting, Peter said. She told me to tell you that she has waited 60 years for this, and 1 more night is nothing. I smiled. She's right. The hegemony filed 3 more procedural challenges overnight, Peter said. All 3 were reviewed by the night duty archivist and rejected before 6 in the morning. They're now logged in the permanent archive. How many challenges does that make in total? 47, he said. Everyone rejected. Every rejection logged. I thought about that. 47 challenges. 47 times the Council's own procedural system had looked at the coalition accords and said, this is valid. This is correct. This cannot be refused on technical grounds. What about the hegemony communication lines? I said. They restored partial capacity this morning, Peter said. Enough for basic operational communication. We thought it was time. We had restored it deliberately. We needed Vorsavith's home government to understand what was happening. We needed them to receive the full picture, not because we were afraid of them, but because we needed them to know, before the vote, that this was not a bluff and not a miscalculation. We needed them to make a fully informed decision about how they wanted to handle the morning. "What are they saying?" I said. Peter hesitated, not because he did not know the answer. Peter always knew the answer, but because he was choosing how to say it. "Hegemony Central Command has sent Vorsavith an advisory," he said. "It recommends that he consider the full spectrum of available responses." "Which means they don't know what to do," I said. "Which means they're scared," Peter said, which was the more direct version of the same thing. I nodded, not with satisfaction, just with recognition. This was the moment, the pivot point, the place where the next 12 hours would determine which of two very different futures the galaxy was going to live in. I had planned for this moment for 22 years. Nora's office had planned for it for 30. 19 species had organized quietly and carefully for years to reach it. And now it was just a night, and a morning, and a vote. "Get some sleep," I told Peter. "You should too," he said. "I will," I said. He did not believe me, because I was not sure I believed it myself, but he nodded and left. I sat at the desk for another hour, then I lay down on the narrow bed in the corner of the room, and closed my eyes, and thought about my first day in the observer gallery, 22 years ago. I had been 34. I had been idealistic in the careful, guarded way of someone who had already been warned that idealism in diplomacy was a liability. I had believed in process. I had believed that if you showed up, made your case well, and were patient, the system would eventually do what it was designed to do. I still believed in process that had not changed, but I had learned, over 22 years, that process is not self-executing. Someone has to build it. Someone has to protect it. Someone has to be willing to use it, fully and without apology, when the moment comes. The moment had come. I fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning, and woke at 5, which was 4 hours more than I had expected. I washed, I dressed, I picked up the datapad with the coalition accords, which I no longer needed, because I knew it well enough to recite it, but carried anyway, because it was the right object to carry into the right room. I walked to the chamber. The vote was at 9. I was there at 6. And once again, for the second time, I stood in the empty room and looked at the table and the seats and the light coming down from the galaxy above. And then the delegates started arriving. By 8:30 the chamber was full. The energy in the room was different from the morning of the emergency session. That morning had been the energy of something unexpected happening. This morning was the energy of something inevitable arriving. Everyone in the room knew what the vote was going to be about. Everyone had read the accords, or at least the summary. Everyone had seen the 47 failed challenges logged in the archive. Everyone had watched the Orally Compact break ranks and sign on as co-sponsors. Vorsavith took his seat. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a man who had done the math and arrived at an answer he did not like. The speaker called the session to order. The coalition accords were formally presented to the full council. The floor was opened for final statements. Soren spoke first, from the Mirani delegation station. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not talk about the accords. She talked about what it had meant to spend 60 years asking to be heard and being told to wait. She talked about the species who had not survived long enough to see this morning. She talked, very quietly, about what it means to a civilization when the largest governing body in the known galaxy tells it, year after year, in careful and kind language, that it is not ready to be taken seriously. The chamber was absolutely quiet while she spoke. When she finished, she sat down. And then, and this was the part that I had not planned, and that no one had planned, and that was perhaps the most real thing that happened in that room over 3 days. The delegate from the Shari Collective, Archivist Luveth, who had not been a member of the coalition, who had simply been doing her job as a committee chair, began a slow, rhythmic sound with her hands. It was not a sound I had heard before. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Then, from the Mirani station, from the Cheth station, from 17 other delegation stations, And then from sections of the main member seating, more sounds joined it. Different rhythms, different textures, different physical expressions of the same thing. Every species in that room had their own version of it. They were applauding. 4,000 beings, for a woman who had waited 60 years. Soren sat very still in her seat. And she was looking at the transparent ceiling panel, at the galaxy above. I could not see her face from where I sat. I did not applaud. I held very still, because if I moved, something inside me that I had been carrying for 22 years was going to become visible, and there were cameras everywhere in this room, and I was not finished yet. The vote opened. I watched the indicators move on the screen in front of me. Yes, 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 yes. Abstention. Yes, 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 yes. The coalition accords passed. The chamber noise shifted, not to chaos, but to something dense and sustained, the sound of thousands of beings processing an event that had no precedent in this institution's 400-year history, the kind of sound a room makes when history turns over. I looked at the screen. I read the numbers again. I looked at the chip I had placed on the table 2 mornings ago, which had been logged, entered, distributed, reviewed, challenged 47 times, and upheld. Peter was watching me from the support section. I looked at him. He nodded once. Precisely. I picked up my personal device. I opened a message to Nora, who was watching from Earth on a live feed through the quiet network. I typed 2 words. It's done. She replied in 15 seconds. Come home soon. I put the device away. Vorsaveth had already stood. He was speaking quietly with the 2 hegemony delegates who had voted against, and from the careful, controlled way he was holding his shoulders, I could tell he was doing what skilled political people do when they have lost a fight they thought they had already won, repositioning, recalculating, finding the way to not have been wrong even when the record was very clear. That was fine. He could do that. The record existed regardless of what he told himself about it. The speaker adjourned the session with the particular gravity that 3 centuries of chairing had built into every word Veldasari used for formal closings. The room began to empty. I stayed in my seat. After a few minutes, as the chamber grew quiet, Vendaro, the Dasari Federation's Grand Archivist, appeared at the edge of my delegation station. She stood there, and after a moment she said, I told you our records matched yours. You did, I said. The Dasari Federation voted yes, she said. I know, I said. Thank you. She looked at me for a moment with her careful, record-keeping eyes. I will be filing a full internal review of the Dasari Federation's conduct toward observer species over the past century, she said. The findings will be made public. That would mean a great deal to a lot of people, I said. She nodded. She left. I looked around the chamber one last time, at the main table where I had sat for 3 days, in a seat that had not existed for me the week before, at the observer gallery behind the frosted glass, empty now, which would remain empty because tomorrow there would be no observer species left to sit in it, at the galaxy above. I thought about the 12 people who had started the quiet office in a room no one was watching 30 years ago, because they had done the math and decided that patience was not enough, and that something else was required. I thought about Nora, at 61, carrying 30 years of careful, quiet, enormous work, to a room full of cameras and 4,000 witnesses. I thought about So-Ren, speaking for 8 minutes about 60 years. I thought about my first day in this chamber, at 34, full of careful idealism and the belief that showing up and being patient would eventually be enough. I had been wrong about that, but I had learned the right lesson from being wrong. Not that process doesn't work, but that process needs people who will build it, protect it, and use it without apology. That was what we had done. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my portfolio and my data pad and the empty chip holder that had held 4,000 pages of work that was now part of the permanent galactic record. I walked out of the chamber, through the main entrance, past the checkpoint where the clerk recognized me now, into the long corridor that led toward the diplomatic transit hub. Peter was waiting at the end, so was Helen. So, to my surprise, was Kella Thrix, who had apparently been waiting for some time, because she looked comfortable in the way that small, patient people look comfortable when they have been standing still for a while. Kella Thrix looked at me. Her eyes were quick and precise, and something in them was different from every other time I had seen her over the last 20 years. "Ambassador Vasquez," she said, "the Cheth Collective would like to extend a formal invitation." "To what?" I said. "To anything you would like to do next," she said. "We have a great many ideas. We have been thinking about them for 60 years. I looked at her, at Peter, at Helen, at the corridor behind me, leading back to the chamber that would look different tomorrow than it had looked yesterday, for the first time in 4 centuries. "So have we," I said. And we walked toward the transit hub, toward the ship that would carry me back to Earth for the first time in 8 months, toward the planet that had spent 40 years being told it was not ready, and had spent 30 of those years quietly becoming ready anyway, toward whatever enormous and uncharted thing was going to come next. Everything, I had said. Everything comes next. I had meant it. I still did.